I rise to support the Amendment 15 in my colleague from Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath's name, and in particular Part B relates to Grangemouth. There is something perverse and absurd if Scottish oil is going to be used and yet Scotland's refinery is going to close. Yeah. I do believe that we have to transition. It has to be a just transition, which cannot just be a glib phrase. It's also something that has to be paced, because we cannot get there overnight. In my constituency of East Lothian, you can see the turbines on the Lammermuirs, and you can see the turbines growing on a daily basis along with the columns as the offshore wind capacity comes. But we require fossil fuels to be able to deliver that renewable capacity. We require the diesels for the trucks. We require the marine diesel for the ships that are setting the columns and turbines. We require the plastics, in particular, that go with much of it. So we require to continue using oil and exploiting it to get to that renewable future. But what we have to do is to do so at a pace that's appropriate, but also ensure that our country benefits. And that's why Clause B in my colleague's name is so important. There is something perverse that in Scotland we have a nation that is energy rich and that people face fuel poverty. In my own constituency, we are not seeing the benefits coming from employment that should be coming with a county that is so energy rich and faces that same problem that Scotland does of being energy rich and yet being able to look wistfully at the turbines on or offshore and being unable to pay your bills. Yeah. We have to ensure that we get jobs and work here. The refinery at Grangemouth is pivotal to that. It has been there for a century. I grew up not in East Lothian but in West Lothian. It's been there for a century because the initial precursor for Grangemouth refinery wasn't North Sea oil. It was the shale industry that was centred in particular in West Lothian, from which BP came with Paraffin Young and others. So BP was the centrepiece, along with ICI, until we now have had various iterations in its Petroleum. But that refinery has been there since 1924, initially dealing with the shale industry, but once North Sea oil was discovered, we used it for North Sea oil, and that is why the Forties pipeline that comes in from the North Sea comes ashore at Cruden Bay and is then piped down to Grangemouth, because it was meant to be refined there. It's also capable of refining from elsewhere, because there's also a pipeline that runs from Finnart in Argyll through to Grangemouth that allows for oil to be imported from abroad and to be refined in Scotland. And yet we face this situation that unless we support this amendment in my colleague's name, then we are going to see the likelihood that Grangemouth refinery will close. Because although the spat has been going on between Labour and Tory, and SNP and Labour and Tory, about the North Sea and about its oil, there has been nothing or little said about what's happening at Grangemouth. The threat has been growing, and in inverse proportions there has been actions from both the government here and indeed the government in Scotland. By all means.
To the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm sure he'll have heard me reference Grangemouth and its future in my contribution. I support his ambition to maintain a hydrocarbon future at Grangemouth as long as it can be economically and environmentally sustained. Does he agree with me, though, when I raised Grangemouth in my speech, that in order to prevent this same jeopardy that's facing the workers at Grangemouth just now from ever re-emerging, that we need to make sure that we get sustainable aviation fuel, biofuels and hydrogen as an integral part of the output of Grangemouth, and make sure that that overlaps with hydrocarbons and then leaves those hydrocarbons behind?
Well, from my discussions both with the shop stewards, indeed with the union, something that the Scottish Government may wish to follow in the lead and not brush them off with very cursory meetings. We do want to get to biofuel strategy for Grangemouth. But let's be quite clear, that is some significant time in the future. Unless we act now, this refinery could close in 2025. Biofuels won't be getting refined in Grangemouth or anywhere else in 2025. So yes, we do want to get to, and the shop stewards and the union wish us to get to biofuels, and Grangemouth must be declared as a hub for that. But to be able to survive until then, what we have to do is to ensure that it is a refinery, not simply a terminal, and that we maintain those skills, which comes on to the point I want to make. It is absurd that we will continue to exploit Scotland's oil and yet Scotland's refinery will close. There's just something perverse about that. Scotland will be the only major oil-producing nation in the world We are ranked at number 21, along with the UK, of the top 25 oil producers. We will be the only one that doesn't have a refinery capacity. That will put us along with nations that produce less oil, but that are largely developing countries. We'll join the club hosted by the likes of the Republic of Congo or Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure they're lovely countries I've never visited. But they are not a developed nation with an industrial economy, and yet the danger is we will be becoming a developing nation in terms of our industrial base and the refinery there. Yeah. Because it's not simply the refinery. The jobs there are important. 500 could go, thousands of contractors, but it's a cluster. That's why I talked about the BP ICI, because ICI clustered next to where BP refined. Petroleum and others now do it, but we have to maintain that. So first of all, it's fundamentally wrong that Scotland should, as a nation, lose its refinery capacity. Secondly, it's also absurd in this world in which we are seeing rocket attacks upon maritime vessels that we risk energy security. Because yes, some of the oil that would be going in and out of, whether it's the Clyde, as I'll come on to, or indeed the River Forth, wouldn't necessarily be subject to attack by Houthis, but your energy security is lessened if you do not have A, your own oil, and B, produce your own oil. And let's remember that 70% of Scotland's filling stations are provided by Grangemouth, and that also the entirety of Scotland's aviation, not just international flights, because in Scotland, domestic flights to Ireland and remote communities are vital as well, are threatened. We would have no control over that, no impact upon it. So energy security dictates it. The economy also dictates it. The loss of skills. This has happened in previous industrial closures, such as the coal mines or indeed at Ravenscraig. We've got to remember that it's not just the current generation who lose those jobs. I grew up many years ago now, not far from where Grangemouth is. People left school, and if they didn't go to the BP or the pits, a lot of them went to the BP ICI. Petroleum and indeed the predecessors there actually trained a lot of people who have skills in industries that we require, even if they only worked there for a few months after they had done their apprenticeship. So this is a loss of skills not simply for one generation, it's a loss for future generations, and it's a loss to a country that badly requires skilled labour because we have a shortage of skilled labour. And the young workforce there, they know that there won't be alternative employment to nip along the M9 or the M8. Many of them will either have to go south or they'll have to go abroad. Our nation will lose as a result of that. The economic devastation, there are arguments over the extent of it. I think the 4% put by Petroleum was too high, but it's certainly approaching 1% of the Scottish GDP. That would be lost to be replaced by coming a terminal, not a refinery. That is simply unacceptable. So there's the economic argument, but there's also the environmental argument. And that's where those who oppose the continued use of refining have to bear in mind. I have people say, oh, well, the emissions at Grangemouth are dreadful. Well, having grown up there, yes, there are emissions, but indeed, as I say, the plant has taken actions, but the footprint will be worse. I did some research, and the House of Commons Library was very supportive of my researcher. What we're going to do is to replace the emissions that would come from the refinery at Grangemouth, to replace them and supersede them gargantuanly by bringing in super tankers in and out. Oil will go out that comes ashore at the Grangemouth from the Forties pipeline to be brought back in by another super tanker to be sold in Scotland. We face the ignominy of having lost the skilled jobs, then having to pay a premium of the oil we import, and we'll get the emissions that will be, as I come on to, Dame Rosie, significant. Because these super tankers, people have seen the quotations of just how much emissions come from a cruise liner in comparison to a private car, indeed thousands, if not tens of thousands of private cars. It's exactly the same for a super tanker. The average super tanker uses 20,000 gallons of marine diesel every day. And we're going to increase the number of ships going out and the number of ships coming in. And it's not just in the Firth of Forth, because we'll be importing into Finnart and Argyll, because that's part of the plan, having lost the refinery capacity. So the bonny banks of the Clyde will not be so bonny when super tankers are coming in. And what about the consideration of the risk? Because I did ask a parliamentary question, but there doesn't seem to have been any risk. What about the environmental risk of increased traffic on the Firth and the Clyde if there's both spillage or indeed an accident with a vessel? We don't want to be another Alaska. No. Ships do have to come in and out, but at the end of the day, when you've got a refinery capacity, you should use it and you should maximise it. You do so because it guarantees economic security, it retains the economic base of an industrial and developed country, and it's environmentally more sensible to ensure that you refine it there with reduced emissions than spewing out a carbon footprint in super tankers going hither and thither out of the Firth and Clyde, around the UK and indeed around the whole of Northern Europe, if not beyond. It is on that basis that it's about time that we committed into statute that Scotland's oil will be refined in Scotland's refinery. Our workers, our country, can expect no less. It is not a great deal of money that is being sought. We're only talking about tens of millions to provide the hydrocracker that will increase the profitability threefold, which the member for Angus should take into account, because if we don't get that hydrocracker going, we won't have a plant by the time biofuels are getting brought into consideration. It's for that basis that the £6.1 billion that the UK government will get in receipts from the North Sea, a modicum, a fraction, must be put into ensuring that Petroleum or our successor remain in Grangemouth.
Hear, hear.
Minister Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Dame.